right? Look, I think this summer we saw volumes come off, we saw volatility lower, and we've seen that pick up now. We've seen that pick up for three main reasons. Number one, we've seen the supply side issues that we faced. This is German government selling, some of the bankruptcies, some of that is abated. Number two, we've seen a big pickup in the focus on the macro environment. The macro environment is a lot softer, and we could talk about what that means. Number three, there's a big focus on the election coming up, what that means for US regulations. And I think for those three reasons, we've seen investors that I've spoken to come through and look again at the asset class and say, hey, maybe we should have some exposure here.
Right. So let's talk about Bitcoin. You're expecting that, on top of the moves that we are seeing at the moment, which I've highlighted just a few minutes ago, you are expecting to see further upward moves when it comes to Bitcoin. Just explain to us why. What is driving this performance for the cryptocurrency?
Yeah, sure. So I think the main thing to focus on right now are two things. One is the macro environment, and number two, it's what folks are thinking about the election. So on the macro side, look, we've seen the ECB lower rates last week. We saw China 50 basis points reserve ratio cut. So we expect two more rate cuts in the US. And whenever we see global liquidity on the rise, guess what? It's great for Bitcoin. But in addition to that, we expect Trump to be a more friendly environment for crypto. And why is that? We see a couple of reasons for this. Number one, Trump went to a Bitcoin conference. I mean, this is just extraordinary stuff. He went to a Bitcoin conference. He said, hey, I'm going to potentially have a reserve for Bitcoin. And this is pretty extraordinary. What that has done is that's changed the picture for investors. Investors are saying, look, the regulatory environment is softening in the US, and I think that might be an explosive upside catalyst for Bitcoin.
Why is Donald Trump good for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies? Because showing up at the crypto event doesn't mean much ultimately. What I would like to understand here is what is the concrete evidence that you have that Donald Trump is going to be a positive for this part of the asset class?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile taking a step back. So up until now, crypto has been a bipartisan issue in the US. Things under the Biden administration were tough for the asset class, and that shouldn't be the case. Crypto must be a bipartisan issue going forward. What we saw Trump really do is he put the spotlight on digital assets by bringing it into the mainstream and talking about it proactively as part of his campaign. And I think what we've seen is we've seen the Harris campaign respond. And what investors have interpreted from that is say, look, the downside tail risk of an administration worse than Biden, that's probably not there. And as a result, we've seen some investors come back and say, look, I'm going to have some exposure because whatever the result of the election, we expect Bitcoin to have a positive regulatory environment in the US. An explosive environment under Trump, and at least neutral, if not slightly better, under Harris.
The reason why I'm asking about this is because when I was reading about some of the reasons on why you decided to launch in Europe, your company highlighted the clear regulatory environment that you have in this part of the world as the reason why you should be here, why you should be in Europe. But when you think about what Donald Trump means for regulation for cryptocurrencies, it's unlikely to be as detailed as what we have in Europe. So how come you see a Trump win as a positive, given that you're actually in favor of more clear guidance for crypto?
Yeah, so what I would say is this. In the US, what we've seen is a softer regulatory outlook than we previously expected. We've seen Fit 21 go through Congress, right? We've seen the Harris administration talk about serving underserved communities, unbanked communities. So the rhetoric in the US is changing. Europe and the UK, they're still ahead of the US, right? But under FSMA 2023 in the UK, MICA in Europe, we actually have a plan for at least stablecoin regulation and a clearer path than I think we see in the US right now. But that might change. And so for Europe to maintain that lead, it needs to be proactive and ensure that we flesh out a clear regulatory framework for the future.